Now then, on to our final part of this first topic. And that is, we're going to be looking at not static games, as we looked at previously, as that last example was. Static games are games where the players move at the same time, where they move simultaneously. Now though, we're going to look at a different type of game. A type of game where players take it in turns to move. They move sequentially. One player moves, sees what that player does, and then chooses his course of action. So they take it in turns. There's a sequencing of moves. And these types of game are known as dynamic games. So rather than static games, which take place at the same time, dynamic games are games where players take it in turns to move. There's an ordering of the moves. However, what we will keep in common with the previous type of game we looked at is we'll still look at games where players have a full and accurate knowledge of the entire game. That is, we will look at games of complete information. And that means, in these dynamic games that we're going to look at, the players will observe perfectly what the other players have done before they move. And they will know exactly what the outcomes of the game are. So these are dynamic games of complete information. The distinction with what we did previously is that they were static games of complete information. Now we're going to look at dynamic games. So, with this class of game in mind, I'm going to start the ball rolling and introduce you to the basic concepts of dynamic games by running through a game of market entry. This is a very, very simple game. And in this game of market entry, there are two players, two firms. We have a potential entrant, or a challenger, and an incumbent firm. And these two players are involved in and around a market. We have an incumbent firm that's already producing within the market, and the potential challenger is thinking about setting itself up in competition against the incumbent. So those then are the two players. An incumbent firm already producing within the market, and our challenger or potential entrant who is thinking about entering the market and producing in competition against the incumbent. So those are the players. What choices, what strategies do these firms have available to them? Well, initially, the challenger or the potential entrant decides whether it wants to enter the market or not. So its available choices are simply in or out. It chooses to enter into the market, or it chooses to stay out of the market altogether. And it's that potential entrant, the challenger, that makes the first move of in or out. Now, if the challenger does choose to enter the market, if it chooses in, then the incumbent firm needs to make a choice. Does it either fight or acquiesce? By fight, we would mean that given the potential entrant enters the market, the incumbent firm would cut prices. It would engage in some sort of competition, some sort of market fight against that challenger. So that's one option. If the challenger enters the market, the incumbent firm can cut prices and it can fight the new entrant. That's one choice. The alternative is to do nothing, to acquiesce, to concede market entry, allow the entrant into the market and do absolutely nothing. So those are the two potential choices of the incumbent firm, to fight or acquiesce. So that's the game that we've set up. Very simple game. We know the players, and now we know their strategies. The last thing that we need to describe is what about the outcomes? What about the preferences of these two firms? Well, the worst case scenario for both firms is that they get involved in a fight with each other, that they start competing aggressively against each other, that the incumbent firm cuts its price. That's the worst possible scenario. That happens, both firms' profits are driven all the way down. And that's the worst possible eventuality, the worst possible outcome for both firms. That they get involved in a price war, that the challenger enters and the incumbent responds by fighting, by cutting its market prices. That's the worst outcome. Whilst that is common for both firms, the most preferred outcome differs. For the incumbent, they would much rather that the challenger did not enter the market at all. They would much rather the challenger stayed out. That happens, the incumbent firm faces no competition, they can keep their prices high and earn the highest possible profit. So that's the most preferred outcome for the incumbent. For the challenger, though, what they would prefer, their most preferred outcome, is that they enter the market and the incumbent firm responds by acquiescing, that it allows it into the market, that the incumbent firm concedes market entry and does not cut its prices. So the least preferred outcome is they get involved in a price war. The most preferred for the incumbent is that the challenger stays out. The most preferred for the challenger is that it enters and the incumbent concedes market entry, that it acquiesces. So that is the setup of our game. In the same way as you would have seen with your seminar sheets, I give you discursively the outcome of the game, the preferences, the strategies. All you then need to do is put it together, represent it. Well, we did that in previous lectures, and on the seminar discussion sheets, you've also done that when we looked at static games. And we represented these games in their normal form. Well, things have changed slightly. We're now looking at extensive games. So we're now looking at dynamic games, which we represent in their extensive form. So this is just a different way of describing graphically that game that I've set up. So, in its extensive form, this game of market entry will look like the following. We start at the top here, and this is where the challenger, the potential entrant, makes his choice. Does he enter the market, choose in, or does he stay out of the market? So those are the two choices available to the challenger, our potential entrant, in or out. Now, if the challenger chooses to stay out, the game ends. And we get payoffs of 1 to the challenger and 2 to the incumbent. Now, in a few minutes, I'll bring this all back, these numbers that I'm using, and just remind you how this reflects the preferences that we've just described. For the moment, though, what I want you to do is note the ordering of these numbers. I said the game ends and the payoffs are 1 to the challenger and 2 to the incumbent. Now, when games are described in extensive form, there's no real rubric of the way in which these numbers should be presented. However, what I'll do in this game is always present the first number as relating to the challenger, and always the second number will be as relates to the incumbent. More generally, though, in every single game that I give you, not just here, not just on your seminar discussion sheets, but also in the exam, I will always present these numbers in the order in which the players move. So the first figure will always be who moves first. In this case, the challenger. The second figure will always be who moves second. In this case, the incumbent. So, challenger chooses out, the game ends, and the payoffs are 1 to the challenger and 2 to the incumbent. However, if the challenger chooses not to stay out, but rather to enter the market, i.e. it chooses in, then it moves us down to the incumbent's choice mode. This is where the incumbent firm decides what it does. Does it acquiesce or does it fight? Acquiesce means it concedes market entry. It allows the challenger into the market without a fight. Or does it fight? Does it aggressively cut prices? Does it fight the new entrant into the market? Well, if the incumbent chooses to acquiesce, the game ends, and the payoffs are 2 to the challenger, 1 to the incumbent. If the incumbent chooses to fight market entry, the payoffs are 0 to both. So that's the general structure of the game. Now specifically, let's look at these numbers. We've got, for each of the challenger and incumbent, we've got the numbers 0, 1 and 2. So, for the challenger, the first figure, we've got a 0, we've got a 1, and we've got a 2. Now, all that does is it orders the preferences. What's the least preferred gets a 0. What's the most preferred gets a 2. And the 1 in the middle is between both of them. So what did we say? For both firms, the least preferred outcome was to get involved in a fight. So there you go. For both firms, they both get their least preferred outcome when the challenger enters and the incumbent responds by cutting prices, responds by fighting. So that was common for both firms. Notice though, the 2s are different. The most preferred outcomes are different. We said for the challenger, the most preferred outcome was to enter the market, and for the incumbent to concede, to acquiesce. So there you go. For the challenger to enter the market and the incumbent to acquiesce. That is where the challenger gets his highest payoff of 2. And then for the for the incumbent, his most preferred outcome, and he gets the 2 there, is for the challenger to stay out of the market. So all we've represented here in its extensive form is what I described previously. That game, that very, very simple game of market entry, where those numbers just represent the preferences that we've described. So the question I want to ask you is, what will the outcome of this game be? Because if you look at the way that I've described it, there are 3 outcomes, or what we might describe as terminal histories. Now, all a terminal history is, or all a terminal history does, is it plots the sequence of choices that lead to the end of the game. So, the 3 possible outcomes, or terminal histories, are firstly, that the challenger chooses to enter the market and the incumbent acquiesces. And this results in a payoff of 2-1. 2 to the challenger and 1 to the incumbent. That's one possible outcome. The alternative, or an alternative, is that the terminal history is in fight, where the challenger chooses to enter market and the incumbent responds by fighting. When that's the case, the outcome for both players is 0. And then lastly, our final terminal history is just out, where the challenger chooses to remain outside of the market. And that results in a payoff of 1-2. 1 to the challenger and 2 to the incumbent. So 3 possible outcomes. Now, when we looked at games, or indeed when we looked at that game right at the beginning of this lecture, I said there were 4 possible outcomes, and I asked you to identify the most plausible one. I asked you to identify the Nash equilibrium. Well, I'm not going to ask you to identify the Nash equilibrium in this game, not yet anyway, but what I'm going to ask you to do, of those 3 outcomes, just take a moment to think, what would the outcome of this game be? We've only got 1 of 3 options. The challenger can enter, and the incumbent can acquiesce. The challenger can enter, and the incumbent can fight, or the challenger can stay out altogether. There's only 1 of 3 possible outcomes. The outcome of this game would be as the majority of people have identified, is in acquiesce. Now, as I said, for the moment, I don't want to give you any theory, but I want to go through the thought processes that you would arrive at, and show you what you arrived at was actually based upon economic theory. So, the reasoning that you would have adopted here is, well, think about the challenger. The challenger knows that he moves first. Does he stay in, or does he choose in, or does he choose out? And he would have reasoned, well, if I stay out, the game ends. But what would happen if I chose in? That my rival, the incumbent, would have the choice to acquiesce or fight. But what's the problem with the incumbent firm fighting? The problem with the incumbent firm fighting is it gives a payoff of 0. It gives the worst possible payoff. If the incumbent responds by acquiescing, it gets a payoff of 1. It gets a more preferred payoff. And so the challenger would reason, if I enter the market, there's no way that the incumbent is going to turn around and fight. And knowing that then, the challenger then has the option. Do I stay out of the market and receive a payoff of 1, or enter the market knowing the incumbent won't fight and receive a payoff of 2? It would much rather a payoff of 2 to a payoff of 1, and hence it would choose to enter the market. And if it enters the market, the incumbent responds by acquiescing. Now, the majority of you, that's the thought process. That must have been the exact thought process that you argued through. And such a process is known as backwards induction. And whenever we set these games up like this, whenever we look at dynamic games and we represent them in their extensive form, that's the way in which we identify the outcomes of the game, by this process of backwards induction. However, there is also another way that I've described to you already that I said led to the only plausible outcomes in games. When we studied game theory, static games last week, we introduced this idea of a Nash equilibrium. And we said a Nash equilibrium is the only plausible outcome of a game. And any outcomes that don't accord with this idea of a Nash equilibrium are not plausible. Well, this outcome that you've all identified here, the majority have identified here, is that also then a Nash equilibrium? Well, we can answer that fairly easily, but we can't answer it easily by looking at the game in its extensive form. What we'll need to do is take that game of market entry that we've set up and represent it in its normal form, as we did last week. So if I were to take that information where we've got our 2 firms choosing over 2 available strategies, and then the various payoffs, we could translate that to the normal form as shown here. Now, in normal form, we just require 3 things. The players, who are the challenger and the incumbent. The available strategies, the challenger, in or out, the incumbent, acquiesce or fight. And then these numbers here were just the payoffs that we described previously. So, if, for example, the challenger chose to enter the market, the payoffs would change dependent upon what the incumbent does. If the incumbent chose to acquiesce, the payoffs would be 2 to the challenger and 1 to the incumbent. If rather the incumbent chose to fight, the payoffs would be 0 to both challenger and incumbent. However, if the challenger chooses to stay out, that's where the game ended. And it does not matter what the incumbent firm does. So the payoffs are exactly the same. 1, 2. 1 to the challenger and 2 to the incumbent. So what I've done, I've taken that game that we've set up and now represented it in its normal form. And given these games in normal form, we've said it's easy then to identify the Nash equilibrium. We just follow that rubric that we set up. For each player and each possible strategy of that player, what's the optimal response of the player? So, very quickly then, if the challenger chose to enter the market, chose in, what would the incumbent firm do? Find to acquiesce. They would choose to always lots and lots to talk when I don't ask you to talk, and now suddenly it's gone quiet. If the challenger chooses in, the incumbent firm, if it acquiesces, gets a pair from 1. If it chooses to fight, gets a pair from 0. And so, the optimal response is to acquiesce. 1 is preferred to 0. If, though, the challenger chose to remain outside of the market, what would the incumbent firm do? It doesn't matter. Both acquiesce and fight give a payoff of 2. So both of them are optimal responses. Hence our circles denote that they're both optimal responses. And that's it for the incumbent firm. Those are its optimal choices. What then about the optimal choices of the challenger, the potential entrant? Well, if the incumbent chose to acquiesce, what would the challenger do? In or out? In. Exactly. In gives a payoff of 2. Out only gives a payoff of 1. So the circle denotes the optimal response, the optimal strategy. And then lastly, if the incumbent chose to fight, the challenger would choose out. 1 is preferred to 0. So in this game, as we've represented it in its normal form, there are 2 Nash equilibria. 1, which is the outcome that we identified by that process of backwards induction, and that one that intuitively the majority of you also identified. And that outcome, that Nash equilibrium, is where the incumbent firm chooses to acquiesce after the challenger has entered the market. So that's our first Nash equilibrium. That's the one in the top left-hand corner. And that one seems fine, that one seems plausible. But there is a second Nash equilibrium. This one here in the bottom right, where the challenger chooses to stay out and the incumbent firm chooses to fight. Now that, as we've set it up, is a Nash equilibrium. And up until this point, I've told you that a Nash equilibrium is a wonderful thing. That a Nash equilibrium is a plausible outcome. Can be the only plausible outcome of a game. This one here, the challenger stays out and the incumbent chooses to fight. It's a Nash equilibrium, but it's really, really problematic. Conceptually, there are a number of problems with that Nash equilibrium. And they're all really bundled up together. Now, what's the point of a Nash? What underlies a Nash equilibrium? That players have no incentive to deviate. So if we to ask either of these players, given that Nash equilibrium, would you wish to choose something else? The obvious answer is, what's the obvious answer? Opposite of yes. The obvious answer is no. Neither player has an incentive to deviate. That's what makes it a Nash equilibrium. So if we said to the challenger, if you knew the incumbent was going to fight, would you wish to do anything different? Would you have an incentive to deviate? You're currently choosing out. Would you wish to change to in? Would you wish to go from 2 to 0? The answer's no. So that's what makes it a Nash equilibrium. But think though, that question I asked and the language that I used, we said to the challenger, if you knew the incumbent was going to fight, would you wish to remain out of the market? Well, of course they would, but the point of it, that language that I used, it suggests some sort of commitment there. It suggests that the incumbent firm has committed itself to fighting. Well, when I set up this game, I didn't say that there was any commitment at all to fight. And yet, for that outcome here to be a Nash equilibrium, that is what is implicit. That there's this commitment to fight. But there is no commitment within this game. And that's problematic first. However, even if the incumbent firm had committed itself to fight, this commitment isn't credible. You can imagine what would go on. Even if the incumbent said, if you enter the market, I'm going to cut prices. I'm going to fight market entry. The incumbent firm could have said that. It could have issued that threat. Is it a credible threat though? What's going to happen as soon as market entry occurs? Would the incumbent firm follow through on its threat? No. As soon as market entry has occurred, we've just shown the only credible response is to acquiesce. It isn't to fight. So even if the incumbent firm had issued that threat, that commitment to fight, this threat is not credible anyway. And bundling these two up together, what's the real problem with that Nash equilibrium in this game? What we're totally and utterly doing is ignoring the dynamics of the game. And after all, what we've got here is a dynamic game, where the players take it in turns to move. And what they choose to do can change. It can change as the game unfolds. Players don't assume a once and for all strategy. They see what their rival has done, and then they choose what to do. Well, this Nash equilibrium here of outfight completely and utterly ignores all of these dynamics. It assumes that the incumbent firm is adopting a once and for all strategy to fight at all costs. And we know as soon as market entry has occurred, it won't fight. It's going to acquiesce. So for all of these reasons, this Nash equilibrium here is very, very problematic. And so what this means is when we start looking at games that are dynamic, these sorts of games that we would represent with these game trees in their extensive form, we need something more than that simple concept of a Nash equilibrium. We need something else that's going to identify our plausible outcomes. And that something else that I'm going to show you is not just a Nash equilibrium, but rather it is a subgame perfect Nash equilibrium. So if you look at that concept, subgame perfect Nash equilibrium, I'm assuming by now, you're all comfortable with that part of what a Nash equilibrium is. That's where all of the players are choosing an optimal strategy. Okay? That's simple. But in dynamic games like this, these Nash equilibria also need to be subgame perfect. And that's the part, so far, you don't know what it is. It needs to be subgame perfect. Well, what is that then? Well, the first part of that is a subgame. Now, you know what a game is. All these scenarios that we're running through are games. But what is a subgame? Well, a subgame is simply that part of a game that remains after an action has occurred. So if we were to look at our game, if we were to look at our game of market entry, after the challenger has chosen to enter the market, where the incumbent then chooses between the outcomes or the actions of acquiesce or fight, well, that is a subgame. Action has taken place, market entry has occurred. And then there's a little mini-game that's now being played. And that is this subgame here. So the subgame is the part of the game that remains after an action has taken place. I'll say this, and this really is a minor technicality. If you don't write it down, it doesn't matter. You wouldn't need to remember it for an exam or anything. But as a technicality, in this game there are actually two subgames. I've shown you one there. In any game in its extensive form, the first subgame is the game in its entirety. So of any game, that's always the first subgame, the entire game. And then what we have here is a subgame proper, where the incumbent is choosing to acquiesce and fight. Now, don't worry about that technicality. All I want you to do is concentrate upon that proper subgame there. For an outcome to be subgame perfect, for a strategy to be subgame perfect, it needs to be an optimal strategy in all subgames. So think about that Nash equilibrium that we described. That one of out-fight. And in particular, I want you to concentrate upon that strategy there, chosen by the incumbent to fight. For a strategy to be subgame perfect, it needs to be optimal in all subgames. Well, that subgame that was played, where the incumbent chooses to fight or acquiesce, is fight ever an optimal strategy? No. If you fight, the incumbent gets a payoff of 0. If it acquiesces, it gets a payoff of 1. Therefore, the strategy of fight is not subgame perfect. Hence, what have we got here? We've said that there were two Nash equilibria in this game. One of inacquiesce, the other out-fight. But whilst they were both Nash equilibria, only one of them, and that's the one that we identified by backwards induction, is subgame perfect. And therefore, that is the only plausible outcome in the game. Hence, any outcome that we're going to identify using in these extensive form games, as well as being a Nash equilibrium, also needs to be subgame perfect. And any outcome identified by that process of backwards induction will fulfill both criteria. What we've done so far, what I've done so far, is I've introduced you to this idea of backwards induction, and we've explained through logically what it is. And we've seen this game of market entry, and we've seen plausibly the only outcome of this game, that one identified by that process of backwards induction. And it's a logical, plausible outcome. And that is a subgame perfect Nash equilibrium. Now what I want to do is show you a more formal way of identifying the subgame perfect outcome, by extension, subgame perfect Nash equilibrium in any finite game. And by a finite game, I mean a game that's got a definitive end period, a definitive end point. So, the rubric is really, really simple. I'll go through it and it'll probably take longer to explain it rather than it will take you to appreciate what's going on. So this process of backwards induction for any finite game will work as follows. What you need to do is go to the very end of the game. You start right at the end and look for all of those sub-games where the players move in the last turns. So I look for these final sub-games and identify the optimal actions of the players in those final round of sub-games. And then we take those actions as given. So remember, what the players want to do, they will look at their available strategies and choose their most preferred outcome. So that is what they're going to be doing in this final round of sub-games. And then, taking these actions as given, we then find the optimal strategies, the optimal choices of the players who move in the round of sub-games preceding those, the penultimate round of sub-games. So you go right to the end, find the optimal strategies, take those as given, and then move to the preceding round. And then find the optimal strategies in those. And then you take those strategies as given, and then move to the preceding round. And keep on moving backwards until you arrive at the very beginning of the game. That's the process of backwards induction. So even though the way that we've described these games, and we've said the ordering in which the players move, absolutely what you need to do to identify the optimal outcomes is go to the very end. Process of backwards induction. So that's the rubric, and that's all that you need to do to identify the subgame perfect Nash equilibrium, or the subgame perfect outcome, the most plausible outcome in any dynamic game. Now, it might seem very long-worded. It's very, very easy to do. So, is everyone finished copying down? Any dissenting voices? No? Okay. So that then is our process of backwards induction. All I'm going to do now is give you a very, very simple example. And deliberately, what I've done, I've chosen an abstract example. We've now got a game where player 1 and player 2 are taking it in turns to move. Player 1 moves initially and chooses between two available choices, A or B. So player 1, if he chooses A, then if player 2's turn to move, does he choose C or D? When he does that, the game ends. Outcomes 2 to player 1, 1 to player 2. If, though, player 1 chooses B, player 2 then chooses over the available strategies or choices of E or F. And then if he chooses these, the game ends with these payoffs down here. Remembering again, the first figure is the payoff to player 1. The second figure is always the payoff to player 2. Now, when we went through that game of market entry, given the way that the game was set up, given the reasoning you could adopt, it was fairly logical what the outcome of that game was. It was fairly obvious to identify what the outcome would be. This game, though, I've deliberately given you an abstract game. There's nothing else that you've got to help you to identify the outcome. So if you look at these 4 terminal histories, you've got AC, AD, BE, and BF. Which one will be chosen? which would be the most likely outcome? What would be the subgame perfect Nash equilibrium? Well, if you just glanced at it, you might say, well, what might the outcome be? The highest payoff that anyone can get with these numbers is 3. So this terminal history here, AD, that's 3 to player 1. So that might be a possible outcome. Having said that, though, you've also got that terminal history there, BF, where this time player 1 only gets 1, but now player 2 gets an outcome of 3. So possibly is the outcome of this game either of those two. Well, let's look at this process of backwards induction. Let's work through this process of backwards induction and see what the outcome actually is. So, what did our rubric say? To identify the subgame perfect outcome of any game, we go to the very end. We look at those final round of subgames. And in the game that we've got here, the final subgames are where player 2 makes his choice. Here on the left, choosing between C and D. Here on the right, choosing between E and F. So that's the first thing we need to do. What are the optimal strategies of player 2 in these final round of subgames? So, this one on the left, when player 2 is choosing between C and D, what would he choose? C or D? C, exactly. The important thing here, which you've all done, well done, is you need to look at the second figure. So if player 2 chooses C, he gets a payoff of 1. If he chooses D, he gets a payoff of 0. And hence, we can exclude D as a viable option. In that subgame there, player 2 would never choose to play D. So we remove it, that squiggle there denotes that I'm removing it as a viable option. Player 2 would never choose D in that subgame there. Well, what about the subgame on the right-hand side? Where player 2 is choosing between E, that gives a payoff of 2, or F, that gives a payoff of 3. We would obviously much rather 3 as opposed to 2, and so we can exclude E as a possible strategy. And that's it for the first part. We've identified the optimal outcomes in the final round of subgames. On the left, it's to choose C. On the right, it's to choose F. We've now taken those, identified those, take them as given, and then we move to the preceding round. That now is where player 1 is choosing between A and B. And so the question that player 1 asks himself is, do I want to choose A, knowing that 2 will respond by choosing C and get a payoff of 2, or do I want to choose B, knowing that player 2 will respond by choosing F and get a payoff of 1? So what's he going to choose? C, exactly. So we know, he won't choose C, but he will choose A, knowing that player 2 will choose C. Hence, we can remove B as a viable strategy. And so, what's our outcome here? The subgame perfect Nash equilibrium, the subgame perfect outcome, is actually not one of the two that I mentioned previously. One of the two, when you looked at that game, might just have jumped out at you. We said, was it that one there? Maybe AD. Was it that one there? BF. It's neither of them. The subgame perfect Nash equilibrium, the subgame perfect outcome, is AC, where the payoffs are then 2 to player 1 and 1 to player 2. That is our subgame perfect Nash equilibrium. Now I'll bandy the terms around subgame perfect outcome and subgame perfect Nash equilibrium, because essentially they are the same thing. As we've shown previously, any outcome that is subgame perfect is also a Nash equilibrium. So every single subgame perfect outcome is a Nash equilibrium. So it's a subgame perfect Nash equilibrium. It's just the reverse wasn't true. Not every Nash equilibrium is a subgame perfect outcome. And for a dynamic game like this, that's what we require. Outcome, subgame perfect. It's a subgame perfect Nash equilibrium. And there you go. That's how you identify it by the process of backwards induction. The thing that you need to remember, it is straightforward. Just remember the order that these preferences are represented in. And when you're looking at which strategy to exclude, just remember you're looking at the appropriate figure. So, that then is the process of backwards induction. Very, very quickly, and I want to return to that game of market entry, and just go through the formalities of identifying the subgame perfect outcome, but also use it as an opportunity to introduce you to this idea of commitment. And in dynamic games, commitment is hugely important. And I could spend probably the next 4 or 5 lectures just talking about commitments and threats. But I'm going to give you a very, very brief introduction to the idea. So that was our game of market entry, where the incumbent, the challenger, decided what to do. What did we say the outcome was? It was that when they were in acquiesce. Well, very quickly, how would we identify this by backwards induction? We would go to the final round of subgame, where the incumbent makes his choice. Does he acquiesce, or does he fight? If he acquiesces, gets a payoff of 1. If he fights, gets a payoff of 0. Hence, we know in that final subgame, he's never ever going to fight. It's not a plausible strategy. Then we take that acquiesce as given. That's the optimal strategy. And then we move to the preceding round. This is where the challenger chooses out and gets a payoff of 1, or chooses in, knowing the incumbent will acquiesce and gets a payoff of 2. What would he rather, 2 or 1? Obviously 2. And so we know the incumbent won't choose to stay out in the first round. And so our subgame perfect outcome of in acquiesce, as we identified before, means that the challenger gets his most preferred outcome. This is the part now I'm going to start bringing it round to that idea of commitment. So that's our subgame perfect outcome. We showed that before, identified by the process of backwards induction. But now look at the outcomes. That most plausible outcome in this game, in acquiesce, means the highest payoff, the 2, goes to the challenger. Everything of all the outcomes that the challenger could get, the one that we observe is the challenger's most preferred outcome. He gets 2 there. He went there, he'd get 0. Went there, he'd only get 1. So it's his most preferred outcome. So for the challenger, this is absolutely fantastic. What about the incumbent firm? Well, that outcome, the incumbent firm gets a 1. It's not its most preferred outcome. It's better than getting 0 there, if they both end up fighting, but the incumbent firm would much rather get this outcome here, where the challenger stayed out of the market altogether. If it did that, the incumbent firm could get his most preferred outcome. But it's not the outcome of the game. So therefore, there's a problem for the incumbent. So what could he do? Why do we get this outcome? Now, the incumbent firm could make as many threats as he wanted. He could say to the challenger, if you enter the market, I'm going to drive you out. I'm going to cut prices. I'm definitely going to. He could make that threat, that commitment to cut prices. But what's the problem? Is that threat or commitment credible? No. It's what we said before. That threat, that commitment isn't credible. Because as soon as market entry occurs, and the incumbent has the choice to acquiesce or fight, what does he do? He acquiesces. Doesn't matter what he says, that commitment to fight is not credible. And hence, because the commitment to fight is not credible, the incumbent firm cannot keep the challenger out of the market, and therefore he can't achieve his most preferred outcome. So, what I want you to think about is there something that the incumbent firm could do to make credible this threat to fight? Well, I'm going to change that example ever so slightly. Well, actually, it's the exact same example. I'm just going to word it slightly differently. And this idea, this game that I want to show you, to do with commitment and credible commitments, we'll call burning bridges. As you can guess, art was never my strong point in school. So, what we have here with this game of burning bridges, there are two countries. Country 1, and there you go, on the left-hand side, country 2. And these two countries have an island between them. And this island that sits between these two countries is attached to each mainland by a bridge. Now, both countries would like to occupy this island. That's what they want to do. They want to own the island that sits between these countries. Currently, though, currently Country 2, the army of Country 2, occupies the island. So that's where we're currently at. Now, for Country 2, this is fantastic. It wants to occupy the island, and that's exactly what's happening. However, Country 1 isn't happy. It wants to occupy the island, but it doesn't. Therefore, it will need to do something. And this, then, is where this game of burning bridges comes in. So Army 1, Country 1, is unhappy about the status quo at the moment. It wants to occupy the island. So, it has a choice. It can either leave its army where it is, in its country, so do absolutely nothing and just accept the current situation. Or it could choose to invade the island. It can send its army across the bridge to the island. The problem that arises, though, is that if Army 1 chooses to invade, Army 2, which currently occupies the island, needs to decide, does it stay there and fight the incoming army, or does it retreat? Does it retreat back over the bridge towards its mainland? So that is the game that we've got. Army 1 can choose to stay put or invade. Army 2 then chooses to fight or retreat. So that's the game that we've set up. Now, in terms of the outcomes, the worst possible scenario for both countries is that they get involved in an armed conflict. They don't want to fight each other. That's the worst possible outcome. But the best possible scenario for both countries is that they occupy the island. But only one of the countries can do this at a time. Only one of the armies can be on the island to occupy it. So that's the most preferred, that you occupy the island. The least preferred is that the armies are involved in an armed conflict. So, what have I done? I've set this dynamic game up for you. We've got the players, we've got the strategies, and now we've got the preferences, the outcomes. So, in its extensive form, that is what the game would look like. And apart from the labels, that is the exact same game of market entry that you saw previously. We said we've got Army 1 makes the choice of invade or to stay put, not to invade. If Army 1 chooses to invade, then Army 2 chooses to retreat or to fight. So we've got these outcomes, 0, 1 and 2. 0 is the least preferred, 2 is the most preferred. Exact same game, only the labels have changed. Substitute Army 1 for the challenger. Substitute Army 2 for the incumbent foe. Invade was in, do not invade, you stay out. And then retreat was to acquiesce, concede, fight is to fight. And then these numbers are exactly the same. And so what did we say the outcome of this game was? In that game of market entry, it was in acquiesce. Here, because we've changed the label slightly, it's invade, retreat. But that is the sub-game perfect outcome of this game. And what does it mean? I want to bring this back again to the idea of commitment. That sub-game perfect outcome that we identify here means that Army 1 gets its most preferred outcome. Army 2 only gets a payoff of 1. If only, sorry, Army 2 only gets a payoff of 1. If only Army 2 could convince Army 1 that it would fight the invasion, that if you come over this bridge, absolutely, I guarantee you we're going to fight. If you can make this threat credible, that commitment credible, then what would Army 1 do? Would it invade, knowing that a fight is inevitable, and get a payoff of 0? Or would it choose not to invade in the first place and get a payoff of 1? It would much rather choose the latter. But the reason it doesn't is because this commitment to fight is not credible. It doesn't matter what Army 2 says, as soon as an invasion takes place, it will retreat. However, what could Army 2 do to make that threat credible? To make that commitment to fight credible? To convince the other army not to invade, and hence get its most preferred payoff. What could it do? Well, it could credibly commit itself to fighting by burning the bridge between the island and the homeland. So if it did this, Army 2 burnt the bridge, retreating is no longer an option. That bridge doesn't exist. There's nowhere for the army to go. Now that it's done this, what does that mean about the commitment or the threat to fight? Army 1 will reason, well, if we invade Army 2, they can't retreat. All they can do is fight. And so we would get a payoff of 0. However, we've got the option of not invading and receiving a payoff of 1. So, given that, what will Army 1 choose to do? Army 1 will choose not to invade, knowing that an invasion will automatically be met by fighting. And hence, that commitment to fight has been made credible by the burning of the bridge. And as such then, that commitment credibility has led to a new sub-game perfect Nash equilibrium. Now if that commitment, that burning of the bridge wasn't there, we wouldn't get that outcome. We would get the outcome here of invade, retreat, down in the bottom left. But the deliberate actions of one of the players within the game, in this case Army 2, has led to a different sub-game perfect Nash equilibrium. So that threat to fight is now more credible. Now, as a military tactic, there are lots and lots of examples across this over the course of history. I mean, just to give you one very, very simple example I like to use in the Game Theory lectures that I give, relates to the idea of Hernan Cortes and when he landed in Mexico. So when he and his troops landed in Cempoalla, they were faced with the Aztecs. Now the Aztecs weren't very friendly people, and they weren't particularly enamoured to see the Spaniards landing on their shores. So what was the problem? You had the conquistadors, a very, very limited number of Spaniards, and you had literally thousands upon thousands of bloodthirsty Aztecs. So you might think, well, okay, there's only going to be one outcome here, and it didn't look good for Cortes and his men. So what did they do? Realising that they were vastly outnumbered, Cortes ordered all but one of his ships to be burned or disabled. And so the Aztecs, who were descending upon them, saw this, and they then knew that the Spaniards had no option of retreating. If they were attacked, all they could do was fight to the end. It's the only option that they had. Fight to the end or face an even more gruesome fate at the hands of the Aztecs. So, what happened? Did Spanish spread through Latin America? Or did the Aztec culture persist? Obviously, the former. Faced with such a determined foe, the Aztecs had the option themselves of not attacking. And that is exactly what they did. And so they retreated back into the hinterland. So you see, the deliberate actions of one party affected the outcome of the game. This here, burning bridges, is just a very, very stylised example. But there are lots and lots of scenarios that you can pick up through history that exemplify the exact same principle. Now, what I want to do to conclude for today, before we talk about the assignment, is give you one more example. One more example relating to this idea of business. So, relating to this idea of commitment. And I want to just phrase this in terms of businesses and contracts. Now, whilst we've talked about burning bridges, in an economic sense, or in a business setting, you don't literally burn bridges to deter your rivals. Often what happens is firms will use long-term binding contracts to provide a check upon potential competition, to make their threats credible. So we're going to take that pretty much that exact same example that we used before about the incumbent and the potential entrant. And I'll say that this example relates to two off-licenses. So we've got two off-licenses, we've got threshers and you've got odd bins. Now, threshers is the incumbent firm within the market. And odd bins is thinking about setting up in competition. It's thinking about encroaching upon the market of threshers, either in terms of a specific product line or in terms of geography. It doesn't really matter. But odd bins is thinking about setting up in potential competition. Now this is in spite of the fact that Thresher says, don't you dare. If you compete against us, what we'll do is we will engage in a price war. We will cut our prices. We will not allow you to enter our segment of the market. So that's what Thresher said. What will happen? Well, we've just seen our game of market entry. That threat, that commitment to fight is not credible. Because as soon as market entry occurs, what will Threshers do? They'll concede market entry. They'll acquiesce. They will not fight their rival. But think, how would this situation change if Threshers had a long-term supply contract with producers of Bordeaux wine? So each and every month, they were committed, legally committed, to buying a certain quantity of wine. They'd have no choice. They've got to buy the wine because they've got a long-term binding contract. Now think of the situation. If Odd Bins enters the markets What can threshers do? Can they buy less wine? No. They've got this contract. They've got to buy the wine. Can they have stocks of wine accumulated on their shelves? Again, in terms of profitability, that's not something they can do. The only thing that they can do in order to shift this wine that they're committed to buying is to fight market entry. If they want to sell the wine, they've got to cut the price. And hence, this threat, this commitment to fight market entry is more plausible. Without that long-term binding contract, there's nothing at all that threshers can do to keep odd bins out of the market. Anything that it might say, these threats, it's all posture. It means nothing. However, a long-term binding contract works in exactly the same way as we saw previously with that example of burning bridges. It removes one of the viable options. In this sense, it removes the option of acquiescing. And with that then, the only response is to fight market entry. And so, odd bins with reason, if we enter the market, threshers will fight us. Whereas, if we sell to the market, that is a more preferred outcome. And hence, by having a long-term binding contract, the outcome of this game is changed. And often, in a real-world business setting, that's exactly why firms do invest in such contracts, to deter potential competition.